So anyway, welcome to Warsaw. Welcome to this conference on harm reduction and nicotine. And what I'm going to do here is just offer my best thoughts as I can. I have to start by just saying it's an honor to be giving an address named after Michael Russell. I think the one time that Michael and I crossed paths was in the spring of 1992, 25 years ago, at the Third International Harm Reduction Association Conference, notably an organization that was previously headed by Jerry Simpson, and one where the person who will speak after me, Alex Wodak, was pivotal in organizing that conference. And it was notable that even back there 25 years ago, the link was being made between harm reduction with respect to the illicit drugs and harm reduction with respect to the legal ones. Now, as somebody who's been involved in this effort to end the war on drugs and to advance harm reduction approaches with respect to illicit drugs for really 30 years, and who's kept an eye on this field of tobacco and nicotine harm reduction throughout that time, my first thought to say to you is you're on easy street compared to what we in the illicit drug field have been dealing with for all these years. Easy street. I remember there was a movie years ago, about the year 2000, called Wag the Dog. I don't know if any of you ever saw the movie Wag the Dog with Dustin Hoffman and Robert De Niro, and it's about a president, sort of Clinton-esque, although in some respects ends up being kind of Trump-esque, where a war is created, and De Niro's the guy who's kind of called in for emergency situations, and Dustin Hoffman's the Hollywood producer who's used to, and whenever, there's always a new crisis breaking out every 20 minutes. And they always have the same response, the two of them. De Niro, I'm working on it. Hoffman, this is nothing. This is nothing. The world's about to blow up. This is nothing. We've seen it before. And so from my perspective right now, hey, we're working on it, moving forward with nicotine harm reduction. But on the other hand, this is nothing compared to what's been done in other areas. So I think that you can learn a lot from what we've been through. And I think to some extent, we could probably learn a bit from what you're going through right now. Now, why do I say easy street? I mean, first of all, the drug you're dealing with, nicotine, is essentially one which is consumed by hundreds of millions, a billion in one form or another all around the world. And those people are people who can still do it openly, more or less, in most parts of the world, who oftentimes dress like we do and wear nice outfits and suits and ties, et cetera, who are part of normal society. And they may be a bit stigmatized here and there, but by and large, right, compare that with the marijuana users, the potheads, the junkies, you know, the people with, you know, I mean, all of the imagery. Think about what we had in America. Most of you will be familiar. How many of you are from the United States, by the way? Just raise your hand. Okay, so only a relatively 15% or so. But we had the reefer madness. Some of you may have heard of reefer madness, the notion you smoke a joint, you're going to go out and go kill people and assassinate and rape and all this sort of stuff. That has been part of our ideology. And right now we have a U.S. Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who is very much a reefer madness ideologue. So it doesn't go away. The perception of these junkies and what they're about, the perception of what these drugs do, that you take one puff of, one injection of heroin and that's it for life. That heroin turns you, or that methamphetamine, that these drugs, all, by the way, scientifically without any basis. All based upon myths in so many respects. The notion that it is not just okay but good to demonize these people in the most horrific ways. I mean, in some respects, this has been something that you haven't had to deal with in quite the same extent. We've dealt with a massive prison industrial complex in my country and to some extent around the rest of the world of federal and state and local law enforcement agencies and prison guards and private prison corporations and the unions of prison guards, all advocating for more draconian policies. Not quite the same thing in your area, right? And then you have, of course, the notion that, you know, we talk about the harms of tobacco smoke. But when you talk about what people say that a junkie can do to anybody else, the thieving, the stealing, the murdering, all of this sort of stuff. So we've come from dealing with an area where the levels of stigma, the levels of, and there's another issue. the issue of class. Ours is very much, I mean, it is true that illicit drugs are typically used across all classes, but to some extent that's not believed by most people. It's seen as those are the drugs, heroin, cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, used by those people, oftentimes darker skinned, whether it's in my country or maybe traditional, Indios, peasants, Aboriginal people in other countries, right? Or else poorer people. There's been that element. And to some good extent in this field, you don't deal with quite that same class distinction. There is an element of it. There is an element. Because if you look at who was, for example, smoking cigarettes 50 years ago, it was fairly equally distributed across all classes, from the wealthy suburbs to the inner cities. But as the evidence became more and more available, as cigarette smoking became more and more stigmatized, what you saw was that fewer and fewer of wealthy people had a lot to live for, who were sensitive to the evidence, we saw that began to diminish dramatically, in fact, so that the number of affluent people smoking cigarettes today is dramatically less than it was 50 years ago. Whereas people smoking cigarettes among the poorer classes, working class, that has not diminished in quite the same way, right? So we've had to deal with things that have been quite unlike. And then I think probably the most dramatic in a way was for many of us who got involved in harm reduction and drug policy reform, the thing that drove us even more than the harms that resulted from these policies for consumers was the harms that resulted from prohibitionist policies. For us, the war on drugs, the drug prohibitionist policies, were very much analogous to the experience with alcohol prohibition in the United States. Right? And the logic was obvious that if you criminally prohibit a substance for which there remains a very substantial consumer market, you're not going to eliminate the consumption of this drug. You may diminish it somewhat, but all you're going to do is to throw millions or tens of millions of people into the black market. And the legal tax-paying producers, no matter how much you hate them, will be replaced with illicit producers, bootleggers, drug traffickers, Al Capone, who will create levels of crime and violence and corruption in your own country and around the world. There will be international markets and smuggling and all of this. You will have police being diverted into focusing on illicit drugs. You'll have judges in courthouses overflowing and displaying with non-violent prohibition law violators and displacing other types of crime. You'll have drugs that are being created on the black market and are thereby adulterated and more dangerous because they are illicit. You'll have the degradation of norms. You'll have tens of millions of people violating the law and losing respect for basic norms of civility and law and order. You don't have to deal with that very much, right? And part of what made this so hard was that even as we argued, as our predecessors in opposing and calling for the repeal of alcohol prohibition, even as we tried to make the argument that, look, by moving these markets from a prohibitionist market to a legally regulated market will dramatically reduce the harms of prohibition, we had on the other side pro-drug war forces, including almost monolithically the government, doing its best to conflate the harms of drugs and the harms of prohibition. To blame the modern-day Al Capones and the crime and the violence and the overflowing prisons and jails and the corruption, not on the flawed prohibitionist policies, but instead on the drugs themselves. And that's continued to this day and once again is being resuscitated by our Attorney General and the administration for which he works. So those are all the reasons why it occurs to me first that, well, you guys, it's easy street here. Now, on the other hand, there's many similarities. And let me just start off with the definitions of harm reduction. And here's what I would say about that, and of addiction, I should say. I mean, you're all familiar with the conventional definition of harm reduction, that it refers to those policies and interventions that seek to reduce the harmful consequences of drug use by and among those people who are unable or unwilling to stop using drugs now, right? Those policies and interventions that seek to reduce the harms of drugs, psychoactive drugs, among those people unable or unwilling to stop using drugs today. And that is widely understood that harm reduction efforts complement efforts to reduce or prevent the use of these drugs in the first place. And I think there's something of a consensus on that, right? Now, of course, there's always been other definitions of harm reduction. I mean, there's the opportunistic ones that are sort of sometimes designed by those people who are anti-harm reduction. But if you look at what built this movement, harm reduction is not just a synonym for public health. Harm reduction I would also define as where public health and human rights intersect. Because if you think about it, the public health movement and a public health cause doesn't inherently involve human rights. It involves the preservation of liberty. But to some extent, the public health movement emerges out of the desire to stop the spread of epidemics and plagues. And it potentially involves the government in using the utmost of its police powers, right? Of being able to lock people up in their homes, close off cities, do things that fundamentally violate civil liberties in the interest of public health. Public health can be a potentially totalitarian ideology if not constrained in other ways. And sometimes, in the face of massive epidemics, you may need some elements of reduction of civil liberties. On the other hand, human rights, well, there are international conventions on human rights. We all sort of know it when we see it. But we also know that the human rights movement has been slow to embrace things like the rights of people who use or might consume various forms of psychoactive substances. It's only in very recent years that you see some of the leading human rights agencies, whether the United Nations or the nonprofits, Human Rights Watch and others, really beginning to engage the notion that human rights also applies to those people and involves that basic notion that people don't deserve to be punished simply for what they choose to put in their bodies absent harm to others. That simply put, there's no legitimate basis in medicine or science, or for that matter, ethics or the Bible, that provides a legitimate basis for punishing or discriminating amongst people based solely upon what they choose to put into their bodies. There is no legitimate basis in medicine, science, ethics, or the Bible, for that matter, in saying to a parent who, God forbid, has 3 kids, one addicted to cigarettes, one addicted to booze, and one addicted to heroin, that we're going to treat your children fundamentally different, even though each of their addictions may be harming them in different ways. There is no basis for that. No basis. There's a basis for distinguishing among people upon the harms they do to others, but not for what we put into our own bodies. So this element of harm reduction cuts across all of us, and I think we take some pride in the world of illicit harm reductionists that, in fact, the notion of harm reduction has been embraced in the tobacco and nicotine community, that you essentially adopted and adapted our notion, our fundamental idea. And then there's also the question of how do we find addiction? And, you can look up the definitions in DSM-3, 4, and 5, and how those evolve. You can have this addiction. And, I've tended to define addiction in a fairly simple way, which is addiction equals dependence plus problems. Addiction equals dependence plus problems, by which I mean one can be dependent upon a substance, but it's not an addiction unless it's causing harms to you or causing you to cause harms to others. And conversely, you can have a problem with a substance, but it's not an addiction unless there's some element of dependence involved in it, right? And so from my perspective, you look at things like, for example, methadone maintenance, right? One may be dependent upon methadone, right? But it's not a problem. It's not an addiction. You're not addicted to methadone unless that's causing problems in your life or other, right? And so the problems of addiction can stem in 2 ways. One can be because the consumption of that substance on a regular basis actually causes or is likely to cause substantial problems for your health. Consuming cigarettes on an overly regular basis, high risks, high harms. Becoming too dependent on alcohol, the harm to your liver, et cetera, et cetera. Other drugs as well. But in the illicit drug world, the principal harms of drug use, of drug dependence, stem not just from the drug itself, but even more so from the harms of its being illegal. It's bad enough to be dependent upon heroin, but the difference between being dependent upon pharmaceutical heroin and being dependent upon illicit street heroin is monumental. Pharmaceutical heroin, if you have a regular dosing and take it every day at the same dose, you can live to be 95 years old that way, right? It doesn't destroy the bodily organs, Smoking cigarettes destroy your lungs, maybe cocaine your heart, alcohol your liver. Opioids in a pharmaceutical, no, doesn't do that, right? But when you're buying on the street and it's adulterated, unknown potency and purity, you have to buy it from criminals, use it in discreet places, use dirty syringes if sterile ones are not available. Well, those harms are much more dramatic. And in that respect, you too, in this field, don't have to deal with that devastating impact of transforming a drug dependence into an addiction because of the government policies making that drug use that much more dangerously. Now, that said, what are the similarities between illicit drug harm reduction and tobacco, nicotine harm reduction? Well, from the positive sense, obviously, it's all the same thing. It's trying to reduce the negative consequences of a substance that people want to take. People might want to quit or not, but we're trying to reduce the harms to them of consuming this substance, of putting it into their body. If you're an illicit heroin user, trying to get you onto legal methadone or buprenorphine or now pharmaceutical heroin, as they do in half a dozen European countries and Canada, right? If you're injecting drugs, well, trying to get you to inject, not to share dirty syringes or how to learn how to inject safely, right? That's harm reduction, right? If you're using opioids, making sure you have naloxone, the overdose, the antidote for an overdose readily available among your peer groups, right? That's all harm reduction, right? As it is other forms of harm reduction, which you're familiar with, whether it's designated driving norms, whether it's bicycle and motorcycle helmets, or whether in our case here, it's switching from smoking taking tobacco in a combustible form to switching either to smokeless products, the snuses, the e-cigarettes, or even the heat not burn methods, right? What we mostly share in common, I think, is the nature of our opposition. We all have to deal with the accusations that you're being pro-drug, you're pro-pot, you're pro-tobacco. That's what it's about. Maybe because you like it, and therefore that's not a legitimate basis because there's no such thing as a legitimate consumer in these areas, or maybe it's because of who might be paying you to advance this cause. What else do we confront? The abstinence-only ideology, sobriety, the quasi-religious nature of our opposition, their belief that they are on a true moral cause to make the world drug-free. As the 1998 United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs said, we will create a drug-free world, we can do it. And you hear the same language of tobacco-free. Never mind that there's always been something about this tobacco-free, drug-free thing, which always seems to me fundamentally almost fascistic or totalitarian. Here we are in Europe, not so far, in fact, right in the nation where some of the worst consequences of the Holocaust happened. And the notion of Judenrein, Jew-free, let's make the world free of these sorts of people, these sorts of things. When you put up an ideology that involves making us free, not free as in free in human rights, but free from those people, those consumers, those minorities we despise, and the notion that that is the ultimate objective, then sometimes this issue becomes like a crusade. Cost-benefit analysis, out the window. Scientific analysis, out the window. Doesn't happen. It's all about ultimately getting us closer from 15 to 10 to 5 to 3 to 2 to 1. And no matter what we ultimately need to do to those people, that deviant minority, then so be it. That's what we will do. And the fact that so many of those who advocate vigorously against nicotine harm reduction and for tobacco-free would be horrified by my drawing the analogy, they need to consider it when they use that type of language. Once an addict, always an addict. My field, your field too. Doesn't matter that there's overwhelming evidence. One of the arguments I've made oftentimes is, if you interview most heroin addicts and ask them, what's the toughest drug to quit? You know what most heroin addicts say? Cigarettes. Cigarettes. And then I'll point out that even before the massive growth of all these substitution or nicotine devices, Roughly half of all people, at least in my country, who had ever smoked are now, to some extent, ex-addicts. And every one of them managed to quit without there being prison, incarceration, drug courts or tobacco courts, massive law enforcement agencies, all these sorts of things. So that even with the most addictive substance and form of consumption known to man, somehow we cut consumption by 50% with those, and therefore we should think a little bit when heroin addicts say that's the drug that's tougher to quit than heroin. What else? Massive misperception and ignorance propagated by government. In my country now, the percentage of people who believe that e-cigarettes are more dangerous than cigarettes has actually gone up in the last number of years. And we have federal health agencies actually promoting that propaganda, totally in violation of the scientific principles for which they're supposed to stand. And of course, in the illicit drug field, it's been notorious of that way. We still have it in my country, not so much in Europe, but you go to substantial parts of the former Soviet Union and never mind to Asia, where the most vigorous forms of lying and dishonesty about illicit drugs and the harms is just government official policy. They don't want to call it ideology, but in fact, that is what it is. You're just substituting one drug for another. Oh my God, how much we've had to deal with that. Illicit drug addicts, heroin addicts want to switch on to methadone. All the evidence from all the scientific studies showing that methadone maintenance done right is the best way of putting a heroin addiction behind you and improving health and well-being and reducing crime. You're just substituting one drug for another. And isn't that the accusation that you get too? And the fact that substituting nicotine in the form of e-cigs or snus is dramatically safer than consuming in the form of combustible product, that's just the details, they say. You're enabling addiction. Now we have that, Alcoholics Anonymous, that you can't ever suggest that somebody who has a problem with alcohol could somehow become anything other than sober and abstinent. If you suggest that they might be able to moderate their drinking, you're enabling them. And isn't that what you're doing here too? With your nicotine devices, just enabling people to persist with their dirty and deviant addiction. Stigma's good, isn't it? Go Stigma. I had an interesting question. I got speaking to the California Society of Addiction Medicine a couple weeks ago, and they're saying to me, Ethan, what do you think about it? How do we deal with the issues of stigma involving illicit drug users? And I said, well, I have some ideas about that. But one thing you guys have to do is consider, haven't you been using Stigma to reduce cigarette consumption all this time? So maybe we need to be a little more consistent here. And what else does it all have in common? Well, the evidence is overwhelmingly on our side. Overwhelmingly on our side. What advantages do you have as opposed to illicit drug field? One of the biggest ones is your consumers are still legal in most places. Almost nobody in the world is losing their freedom for consuming nicotine. Almost nobody. That's a massive advantage. And in many countries, it is and is being done openly. And the products are legal in many, many countries to one extent or another. Sure, I know snus is banned in most places here, but you're still legal. You have a lot of advantages to work off of. So what are my suggestions coming from the field of advocacy? Well, here's what we learned. And here are some of the things, because, I look back and 30 years ago, only 25% of Americans wanted marijuana to be legally available, and now 60% do. 30 years ago, marijuana was legal nowhere. Now it's legal for medical purposes in 29 of our 50 states and legal for all adults in 8 states. We had no needle exchange 25 years ago, but we've come a long ways, and even some of the Republicans, including now Vice President Mike Pence, was obliged to acknowledge the science. We have naloxone, the antidote, available, even though that was opposed before as enabling heroin addicts. We're expanding access to different types of substitution treatment. We've made progress. What has been key? Well, one obviously is public opinion research. I don't know how much that's being done. Maybe it is being done, but it was advocacy based upon public opinion research. It was learning what language and what words moved people. I remember in the old days we began to see that, for example, if you asked Americans, do you want to legalize marijuana? You'd only get 30% saying yes. If you asked them, how about making marijuana legal? Went up to 35%. Something about dropping that hard Z at the end that made people ease up a little bit. And then we said, how about treating marijuana more or less like a tough alcohol policy? Tax it, control it, regulate it, try to keep away from kids. Before we got 40%. Tax and regulate became our motto. We realized that certain words were just not working and that you needed to be attentive to the language that we were using. And I don't know how that relates in this field. It's more your field than mine. But understanding what types of language, not being wedded to the words that don't work. Harm reduction. You know, and one has to be nuanced about this. There was a vigorous debate in the international harm reduction movement 10, 15 years ago about should we use the phrase harm reduction because our opponents had demonized the phrase harm reduction and said that anybody who talks about harm reduction wants to legalize all drugs as a libertarian legalizer, which almost none of us drug policy reformers were. And so some people wanted to back off and not use it. And my view was, do what you can to stick with the term. The term has acquired a resonance. There are organizations and journals call this. It's a legitimate term, right? It's not the best one for bold movement-building advocacy, but it's a very good one for advancing things in the middle ground. But on the other hand, you know, if folks in Sweden or Singapore gag when you say the word harm reduction with respect to nicotine, well, my view is, okay, let them call it something else, but keep sneaking it in if you can. Because those countries are countries which are notoriously backward when it comes to dealing with illicit drugs. I mean, whether you're talking about Singapore or the closest thing to Singapore in Europe on illicit drugs, which is notoriously Sweden, those countries are killing people with their policies. And so we need to be sophisticated in our language and the ways in which we did that. I saw that there's somebody presenting a paper here, I think tomorrow, about why the Swedes have such a hard time in dealing with the language of harm reduction. What else do we do? We realized that getting ourselves allies, the sorts of allies who I put it, whose names raise the right eyebrows, respectable people. My organization, Drug Policy Alliance, who do we get? We got the former Republican Secretary of State, George Shultz, and the former Republican Secretary of Defense and Deputy of the CIA, Frank Carlucci. We got Walter Cronkite, the most famous American newscaster in American history, and we got Václav Havel. Right? We got the former head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and we got lots of famous police chiefs. We got exactly the sorts of people that people would go, whoa, you got them, they're with you? And by the way, when we created it, we didn't call it an advisory board, because we wanted to make clear we weren't looking for advice. We wanted them to be blessing what we did. And they didn't have to agree with everything they did, but they had to agree with the basic principles. And it seems to me that this movement could probably benefit from getting the biggest, most respected names from diverse fields involved in this. What else did we do? Evidence, evidence, evidence. Don't stop with the evidence. Go with the evidence. The evidence is our side. But the other part of that is always making sure not to oversell the evidence. Even though we know on some level that if the whole world, if tomorrow you could snap your fingers and everybody in the world smoking tobacco were not to quit but to switch to a nicotine substitution device, an e-cig or snus, it would perhaps be the single greatest advance in cumulative public health in global history. It's probably true in terms of years of lives saved. I don't know that we should say that all the time if it's true. There's a sense of being cautious. If the evidence increasingly shows that making these things available has very little impact on adolescent use of these things, and I have to say, I was struck by a paper I read recently by Ken Warner, the very prominent public health economist from the University of Michigan, been a leading figure economist in the anti-tobacco field, and he sent me a paper he'd given in Florence a few months ago. And what he did was he built a model, and he said, let's take the strongest of the anti-harm reduction nicotine things about what might happen for increases in adolescent youth. And let's take the weakest of the assumptions made about how much we would have a reduction in smoking cigarettes. And let's build a model based upon their most fearful projections of our opponents and the most weakest of the assumptions on our side. And he said, even when you build that model, you still come out with millions of years of lives being saved in coming decades. Give the other side all the due it could, not all it could possibly want, but all it in any possible way merits, and take the weakest of our assumptions, and we know the evidence is strong enough that we still prevail. Well, that other part, of course, which is humanize. For us, putting the patients out and the docs. When we ran our first medical marijuana ballot initiative in California in 1996, who was the face of it? It was a woman in her 50s or 60s who'd been through chemotherapy and had found that smoking cannabis, consuming cannabis, helped reduce the nausea. It was people in wheelchairs dealing with multiple sclerosis for whom taking cannabis helped reduce the tremors. It was these parents today whose kids have something called Dravet's syndrome, a form of epilepsy with dozens or hundreds of seizures a day. We're taking a part of the marijuana plant, CBD, reduces those. Because the fact of the matter is even the most cold-hearted right-wing politicians begin to melt when those people show up. It was those people showing up in state legislative hearings and actually smoking their medicine in front of everybody that helped to move people. The humanization, the putting the patient and the consumer first, and having the people whose family members died of cancer and others stepping up, I think there are few things that can be more powerful than that. So let me just conclude with this. You know, as an American, you know, there were two things I always do when I speak outside my country. The first one was to apologize for the inordinate harms that my country and government has done all around the world with our global war on drugs. The crime, the violence, the narcos in South America, Asia, what have you. And the second one, more recently, is to take pride in the fact that my country has now emerged as the world's leading innovator in responsible policies for regulating cannabis. I'm proud of that. Now I have to add a third. I'm sorry about what my fellow Americans did on our election day. I mean, we elected a sociopath and a psychopath into the White House. How could we do that? You know, the lessons of history have been forgotten. We have something resembling a madman, a narcissistic madman there, and it's horrible. And therefore, the notion that we can count on scientific evidence has been so dramatically diminished. Now, it was incredibly unfortunate that health agencies under President Obama, who moved things in the right direction in his last few years on illicit drug policy, nonetheless put out this reckless propaganda about nicotine. But now we're in an age where, of course, you know, fake news are the words that comes out of the president's mouth every day. We're a guy who's a pathological liar. And it means we have a double, you know, extra burden to carry on all of this. But the fact remains that we have to keep putting out the evidence in the most powerful and creative ways possible. It means that sometimes we have to ally with those people and be judicious, because obviously the role of the tobacco companies and the people who have literally killed tens or hundreds of millions of people now playing a role in this field is an incredibly treacherous form of alliance. And I admire the way that this organization has done its best to mediate and negotiate how you deal with the fact that the people beginning to play a positive role in the field of nicotine harm reduction are, in fact, you know, the people who did all these harms in the past. So we have to be careful. But the last 2 points I'm going to say is, A, you're going to hear in coming years and decades more and more calls for the prohibition of combustible tobacco products, the combustible cigarettes. It's going to be tempting for a lot of reasons, one of which is we know how deadly these products are, and secondly, because prohibiting those substances may advance the financial and prospects in the market for non-combustible nicotine products. Do not go there. Do not go there. Why? Because we can tell you from the illicit drug area that the harms of prohibition are vast. There is almost nothing you can do to provoke a greater increase in curiosity about tobacco products, especially for young people, than to forbid them and to prohibit them and to make them the forbidden fruit. Why? Because fundamentally human beings still have a right to consume things even if it causes harm to their health, so long as they are not hurting anybody else. Why? Because you will never eradicate that market, and because if you cut consumption just down to a tiny percent, if you still have tens of millions of illegal tobacco consumers around the world, that's a market that will be worth hundreds of billions of dollars for the new tobacco trafficantes and gangsters and all that all around the world. And we don't need to fill our jails and prisons with tobacco law violators. We don't need to expand the role of tobacco testing in our society. We don't need to have this sort of hypocrisy. Do not ever please embrace the notion of tobacco combustible prohibition, no matter how good it would be to eliminate that. And my last word is, you here all in the field of nicotine harm reduction, and all of those who have fought for years and decades and in the future to reduce the harms of illicit drugs, we are one. We're fighting for harm reduction. We're fighting for public health and human rights. We're fighting for grounding public policy in science and in evidence. That's the cause. For those of you coming from countries which have draconian drug policies back at home with cannabis or other drugs, take the lessons that you're learning here. And I know you have your own battles to fight, but find the ways as best you can to become those who are articulating the need to take the principles of tobacco and nicotine harm reduction and apply them more broadly into the broader world of psychoactive substances. Don't perpetuate the ignorance and biases and prejudices that so much of the world has with respect to the consumers of those other psychoactive substances. Use this opportunity and your learning experience in the field of tobacco and nicotine harm reduction to broaden yourselves and your ideals, and ultimately to make this world a better place and a safer place. Thank you very much. Thank you.